Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Hello, everybody. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. You look well rested, Marcelo. How are you?
Yeah, not well rested.
You're just like, I'll just pretend. Well, I'm coming to you from the frost-bitten north. It's about minus 10-ish Celsius, so probably like low 20s Fahrenheit, which is nice weather, except when you're constantly going out to take out the dogs, it gets a little bit old. So this is my setting. Clearly, you're a little bit better equipped in a more climatically friendly zone these days. And yeah, welcome to another installment of the Winter Latina Show. I believe it's number 42, which is pretty crazy to me. And you have, do they see our diagram guest on the screen right now or not yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. I just wanted to say, in case you guys see our picture guest on the screen, it's there for a reason. Well, today we want to talk about
on Instagram and TikTok will see it.
They might see it, yeah. Well, today we want to talk about the elephant in the room. We really want to break down the dynamic, the relationship between the United States and the European Union. We want to focus on what it stands to be as today, but we also want to go back a little bit in history and situate it in the early Cold War period, starting with the Marshall Plan going into the present, obviously the establishment of the European Union. And as I always say, history helps us understand the present. The better you can understand it with factual information, statistics, etc. The broader understanding you can develop of current events. And so for that reason, we are bringing back our guests that we've had. It seems like 20 episodes ago. It's like all one blur for me right now. So our guest is Nikola Mirkovic, whom we've had to discuss the situation in France previously, the French elections that took place earlier this year. So he is very well equipped to discuss this topic. He is a geopolitical analyst. His background is from the European Business School, so he has direct knowledge of our topic today. He's also the founding president of the West East Association, and he's a co-founder of, I'm going to butcher this with my broken French, Solidarité Kosovo Association. He has had more than 15 years involvement in various types of humanitarian missions in the Balkans. And he's also been to Donbass. He's published a number of books, which we've also linked to this episode. So he's very, very well positioned to discuss our topic today. So Marcelo, why don't we bring on our picture guest and we'll bring in our actual guest. I can't tell what's on the screen, so that's why I'm deferring to you.
Neither do I. Yeah, no, it all went wrong. It was expected. It's all right. I'll bring Nikola Mirkovic now. Salut, Nikola. Comment allez-vous?
Salut, Marcelo. Salut, Nina. Hello, everybody.
Thank you so much for jumping back on our stream. You were a requested guest from the previous stream, so I'm really happy to have you back here to discuss the proverbial elephant in the room. And what we want to start with is a graph that actually you shared on your social media. I can talk about it as you're bringing it on. Yeah.
I put the graph on the screen. It's not awesome. I'm going to do something about it for a second. Yeah, just please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think as soon it's they don't have to see the details. We can link to this graph, but as you can kind of tell what the two lines are, right? The red line is the combined Russia-China line, and then the blue line is the U.S. line. And basically, what we want to talk about as a starting point is the fact that the United States recently surpassed combined Russia and China as EU's top trade partner. But it didn't happen naturally, so to speak. It didn't happen through the proverbial free markets and competition that sometimes American politicians like to talk about. And so this is why we want to talk about the politics behind these economic trends. And we also want to talk about the European situation on its own, because the EU's economy, especially countries like Germany, is not doing well. If you're tuned into the headlines, even without necessarily going into the details, if you type in Volkswagen into your search engine, you'll see that there are massive strikes going on. They are happening over proposed pay cuts. The company is in danger, right? This is such a classic German brand. And if I'm going to just open another window for me, you don't have to see it. You can look this up yourself. If you type into the search engine German companies move to the US, there's just a slew of information, right? So for instance, I'm looking at a Reuters article from August 1st of this year, talks about German companies' mall relocation due to high energy prices. Then the question is, why are energy prices so high? Does this have anything to do with the fact that Germany no longer uses Russian energy, at least directly, due to the war in Ukraine and all the surrounding details around that? Was Germany forced to stop using cheap Russian energy, which some would say was the, one of the key reasons behind the German economic miracle? Another headline I'm looking at, this is the Financial Times from earlier this year, February 18th. German companies flock to U.S. with record pledges of capital investment. Another headline coming from Deutsche Bank. U.S.-German trade ramps up, but again, to whose benefit? So there also seems to be this outflow of German manufacturing going elsewhere. Sometimes the U.S., sometimes it might be other places. So the European economic situation, especially places like Germany, is not looking very good. So then how can we put all of that into the perspective of US surpassing Russia and China as the EU's trade partner? So Nikola, why don't we start with that sort of situation as we described it, and then we can jump into the past, but we don't have to spend too much time on history if you don't want to.
Well, listen, just to put it bluntly, and I think as you said, we're really talking about the elephant in the room. We can't understand anything which is going on currently in Europe if we don't understand the vision that the United States, Washington has on Europe. And this is a long story. We could go back, if we want to go in history, to geopoliticians like Mackinder, like Spikeman. What they say, just to make it short, but I think it's really important to state this, is that they have a vision of the world. The Americans, as soon as they were, I would say, world superpower, that's in the end of the 19th century, they saw that the place where everything was going on, the center, I would say, the nucleus of humanity is actually between Europe, Asia, and you could add Africa to that. So if you take those three continents, you've got 75% of the world population, 75% of natural resources known. And both of these geopoliticians, they say, well, that's the place to be. That's what they call the heartland. That means that's the center of the world. And if you look at America, South America, Australia, even the UK to some extent, but that's another story. They're islands. They're far away. The US is very far away from where it's all happening. So they have devised a policy whereby, since the beginning of the 20th century, where they say we have to conquer that center of Eurasia. But it's extremely complicated because we don't have so many people to occupy all that territory. So how are they going to go through this? They are going to divide and conquer, divide et impera. So it's just an imperial motto that they've just applied to their own policy. The only difference is that they're an imperium, an empire, which just doesn't say that it's an empire. You know, the biggest deception of the empire is to make believe that he doesn't exist, to paraphrase Baudelaire. So this is what they've seen, and they're worried of one thing, is that they can have a competitor. So since the beginning of the 20th century, they have really been the world's hegemon, this superpower. And we've seen this during the First World War, Second World War. They always come out. They've got less victims than the others. They're not bombed, and they go out and lend money, and people need them. And that's the way the U.S. sees its empire. They need the rest of the world to depend on them because since the end of the 19th century, they have been producing more than they have for their own market. So what do they need? They need markets to get natural resources to produce, and they need markets to sell the products that they make on their own territory. So that's the way the US has been going on, except that they have understood that colonizing other countries is extremely costly. It's dangerous. It's very difficult to impose your way on other people. So they don't colonize people. They don't colonize countries. They've done a bit of that, but they've stopped because they found out that colonizing the elites is much cheaper and it's much easier. So all they want are people who think that their way of doing business, that if the US is strong, the rest of the world is safe, they want elites in the different countries that are aligned on that position. And it doesn't matter whether these elites are from the left, from the right, from communist, fascist, they don't care. They just want to make sure that they've got elites that are, I would say, in line. So since the beginning of the 20th century, they definitely saw that Europe was a part of the world that they did not want to lose because it's a huge market. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe still is globally quite wealthy. It produces, it's a competitor to the US. We make cars, we've got industries, we've got a lot of different things, but we are a main market. We are the main, I would say, main market for the United States because we have the capacity to buy their products where they've got strong added value. So they intervened in the First World War, not because they were afraid that France was going to become German, but because they were afraid that Europe was going to become German. And they didn't want Germany to become a main competitor to the US. And they did the same thing during the Second World War. Let's not forget that the American servicemen, and I've got a lot of respect for those who died on the beaches of Normandy, but they arrived in 1944, 1 year before the end of the war. And this is quite after the Soviets had lost millions of people after Bagration and different military operations to get rid of the Nazis. So the Americans came at a moment where they thought, they were afraid that Europe could either become Soviet or Nazi or German. And this is not something from any conspiracy theory. If you read, I mean, American neoconservatives, they don't even hide this. If you read Elliot Abraham's book called The Big Stick, so he uses Roosevelt's catchphrase, the big stick. Don't make a lot of noise and use a big stick and you'll go far. And he said, however hideous are communisms or Nazism or whatever, the reason we went to Europe is because we didn't want to lose the market. He doesn't hide this. I mean, this is something which is quite blunt and blatant for them. And we in Western Europe, we've got this, this image of the Americans coming over to save democracy, to fight against the evil fascists and all that. It's got nothing to do with it. This is a script from Hollywood. The reality is that young Americans came and died to serve the oligarchs in the United States who didn't want to lose Europe as a market. I mean, whether you find this good or bad, that's the reality of the fact. Since then, the US has been going in the ups and downs, and they've always seen Europe as a protectorate. And again, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book, The Great Chessboard, says Western Europe is a protectorate, like globally Rome had its own protectorates. And this is nothing hidden. This is American policy, okay? So they were afraid because at some time in this Eurasian continent, they saw at the end of the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be a short introduction. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna make it so long, but I'm almost finished. But I really think it's important. Nina, you said it so correctly. If we don't understand the history of these relations, we don't understand what's going on. If you don't understand all of this, then we don't know why there are these wars. Why are these billions of dollars spent on wars? Why are there 700 U.S. military bases around the world? If we don't understand how the U.S. sees the world. Just so to sum it up at the end, what happened in the 1990s is that the U.S. thought that they had won the Cold War and that they won the world. Fukuyama said this is the end of history. So and this is the way they thought about it. And they said we've got to be careful because we've got one risk, is that there could be some sort of competitor which would grow out of the ashes of communism. So we want to make sure that on that territory, in the heartland that Mackinder spoke about, we don't want to see a hegemon. So we want to make sure that these two countries, which scare us a bit, and historically have been always in our crosshairs, which are Russia and China, we want to make sure they don't become superpowers. So they did everything they could to make sure to contain and Russia and China, not because of ideology, not because of democracy or the way they elect their presidents, because they don't want a competitor, and especially they don't want strong nations on the Eurasian continent, because if there are strong nations and the countries between Europe, Asia, and Africa get along, then we don't need the United States, and they become an island. That's a destination we would go to on vacation, because we would become the powerful continent, and we don't need an extra continental power to wage wars between us to make sure that they can control the markets. So this is, I would say, an introduction, something which is extremely, it's paramount to understand this. We have wars in Europe today because the US doesn't want to lose Europe as a market.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you started with classic geopolitics and you talk about Mackinder and the heartland, and the way you've described, summarized American foreign policy is very similar to the way we've talked about British foreign policy on the show previously, where Britain also as an island, as a thalassocracy, right, in classic geopolitical terms, always made sure that there is no major competitor rising on the continent, right? Specifically in Europe, but also that would impact Russia, especially, I would say, in the 19th century onwards. And so their foreign policy was not supporting one particular country. They could support France in one instance, and then they could fight France in another instance. If you actually, look at the relationship between the UK and France for, several centuries. So it wasn't so much about liking or disliking this particular country. It was about making sure that another country is not going to rise up and challenge them. And so, for instance, the UK started supporting France when the threat, scare quotes, of Germany arose on the continent, right, especially with Bismarck unifying German-speaking lands. And so it seems like American foreign policy also, as this island country, as you've described it for classic geopolitics, is very similar in terms of making sure, not about ideology, not about liking or disliking particular countries. It's about crushing competitors and making sure that they remain the dominant power. It doesn't matter who that competitor is, whether it's Germany, which is more along the lines of Western democracy in popular parlance, or Russia, which was, communist and now isn't. It's more about having strong competitors. And if those competitors were to unify, let's say, again, in classic geopolitics, that would be Russian resources uniting with German manufacturing, that would be very, very detrimental to the American control, or Anglo-American control, if you wish, of the European continent, of the heartland, etc. So it's really interesting how that foreign policy sort of transferred itself onto the heir of the British Empire, which of course was more of a traditional empire with direct colonial control, unlike the US, the way you've described it. And the other thing I found interesting is that you talked about how it's much easier to colonize the elites. And you and I briefly discussed a book by Michael Hogan, which was published in 1987. It was about the Marshall Plan, but he made a similar argument. He talked about what happened in the wake of the Marshall Plan, which again was the program for economic recovery of Western Europe after World War II, where of course Americans provided loans, expertise, et cetera, but not because they were so altruistic. It was with, direct benefit to them economically, but also to infiltrate the, institutions, make new institutions, and basically to be there to stay, right, in the long term in Europe. But anyway, Michael Hogan talks about he contrasts what he calls, quote unquote, naked imperialism of the past with what he describes as more of a consensual American hegemony. And that's the hegemony that would perpetuate itself through the elites by creating this class that would benefit from the American oversight financially, ideologically, et cetera. And then it didn't really matter what the population, right, the man on the street thought. It was more important to control the elites. And I think we really see this demonstrated well today, even though we're no longer in 1947 to 1952, right? We're 80 years removed from that period, but it still remains very true. And I wanted to sort of mention this statistic that's from this particular book, because in the popular mind, for people who have a little bit of interest in history, the Marshall Plan is viewed as the thing that rescued Western Europe, right? It was destroyed because of the fighting in World War II. But if you actually look at the statistics, again, this historian he doesn't go as far as I would go, but he does sort of call the Marshall Plan as not this thing that rescued Europe, but as kind of more of a crucial margin that helped Europe, because Europeans basically did their own rescuing in the wake of World War II. So he provides statistics for the duration of the Marshall Plan, where in Western Europe, aggregate gross national product jumped 32%, agricultural production climbed 11% above pre-war levels, industrial output increased 40% against the same benchmark. But local resources coming from Europe accounted for more than 80%, up to 90% of what fueled this post-war economic miracle. And so, again, the question is, to what extent did the Marshall Plan actually rescue Europe? It just seems like the argument of the crucial margin is probably as far as you can take it, because European recovery started happening before the Marshall Plan was even launched, especially in places like Germany, which was obviously devastated. And so even in sort of this popular parlance about Americans rescuing Europe after World War II, not just landing on the beaches of Normandy, it's sort of exaggerated, because Europeans need to recognize that they did a lot of their own rescuing through their own economic power and resources, as opposed to being saved by, these godly Americans that landed in Western Europe in 1944. So I'm curious what your thoughts about that are.
Well, I think you've nailed it. I mean, that's exactly the situation. And it's part of the storytelling. Today, we're telling kids in France and Germany, even in the Baltics, that the U.S. came and saved Europe, and this is not history. This is not historical. This is not the truth. When they came over, as you said previously, they came over because they didn't want to lose the market. And when they came over, they said, now we want to make sure that we keep this market. And the Marshall Plan was part of a program. I won't go as far as to say to enslave Europe, but to make sure that definitely they would remain a protectorate. And so they lent money, and with that money, they gave some of the money, but they said, you've got to buy American. So this has a strong impact on society, because, for example, if you look in France, agriculture was quite small. We had small farmlands, and then all of a sudden we're buying big American tractors. We transformed the whole rural space of France. We've got now, they're not as big as the US, but we do have big exploitations. This is changing the mentality of the farmers. This is changing the mentality of the people. We had a lot of American consultants because they came over. I mean, they had over 160 years of existence, and they came over, the French and the rest of Europe, to explain us how we had to do our accountancy, how we had to do finance, what marketing was, how we had to develop products and stuff. So there was some sort of fascination and all this easy money that they were just printing, because they were high on dollars at the end of the war. They were printing during the war for their economy, the industry. And then when you're not building when you're airplanes or tanks, you've got to do something with your industries. So they had to produce other stuff, and they needed us to buy. So some people say that they kickstarted our economy with helping us with the dollars, as you just said. No, I mean, European countries are old nations, and most of the countries are old nations, and we've been through war before. It's terrible, but I mean, we've got the resource and the know-how to get out of this. And let's not forget. I mean, for example, if you take a country like France, 70,000 people died in France because of American or English bombing. So a lot of the infrastructure that we had to rebuild after the war was actually destroyed by the Allies, and this happened all over Europe. So I mean, this is just, I've got the figure for France. But so there's something quite pervert in this philosophy or this thinking and political thinking that we're going to lend you money to build back something that we destroyed. So of course the Germans destroyed as well. There was a lot of German bombings, but this is something also which is, I mean, interesting to see that the US doesn't care, and they keep on doing that. They've destroyed Afghanistan, Iraq, they've bombed Yugoslavia, and then they come over with their companies and say, we'll help you guys build yourself back because we're altruistic. But in the building of what's interesting is that, so there was the Marshall Plan. They gave out a lot of money and lent some money, but they were also quite behind the building of the European Union. And this is something which is not well known. I mean, everybody thinks in Western Europe today that, okay, Churchill was for the European Union, Edouard Herriot was for the European Union, the people in the Agnelli family in Italy for the European Union, because Europeans didn't want any more wars. And this is something which is actually good. I agree. All these feuds and wars between Europeans is something which is quite crazy, but this is a bit of history of our continent. And what is led, and so there was this will to build some sort of political, I would say, organization where we would try to fend off any ideas of ultranationalism and wars. And this practically came from some good ideas. But as many good ideas, they were recuperated quite soon by the US. Why? Because they wanted to make sure that in this European construction, there was not no will to build something which would be independent of the US. Because if there were so the European Union was built as some sort of political organization which would be able to face off the Soviets and face off the Americans, and we'd have our own industry and we'd be safe because we'd have our own defense and all that. So that's the official script. But in reality, since the beginning, the US infiltrated the organization of this European Union. People like Jean Monnet, which is a French salesman, extremely rich, very close to the US presidency, quite an enemy of Charles de Gaulle, who was one of the architect of the resistance of France. He was, and de Gaulle would say he was actually serving American interests. I mean, this is something that he said. He was involved in the construction of the European Union, which progressively became some sort of, I would say, supranational technocratic power, which is serving the interests of a lot of people, but not of the European people. And at the end, what you see is that many of the decisions which are taken today within the EU, the fact that most countries have to enter the NATO, which is the American Foreign Legion, before entering the European Union, is something which is quite strong when it tells about the philosophy of the European Union. If you have to enter a military organization, which is, I mean, governed by a country which is not even European, I think that just tells it all on who we're serving here within the European Union. And a lot of the policies that were foreign policies that we're following in the European Union are copycat of what's coming out of Washington. We rarely have something coming, if ever have something coming out of Brussels, which is different. We had a war in Yugoslavia, and I spoke to Jacques Delors, who was the commissioner. I was face to face, alone with him, so no media, nobody. And I said, "Why did you let the U.S. bomb Yugoslavia? Why did you let them do this and encourage fighting between nations?" Okay, there were some differences between nations within Yugoslavia, but we could have settled this without war. And so we had a good discussion about this. And at the end, I was saying, and then the Americans came, then they shoved you, they pushed you a bit, and they said, "We're going to handle this situation." They said, no, European Union. I mean, it wasn't called the European Union, it was the European Community at that time. We will handle it. We were for peace. And at the end, I started sensing that he was a bit tired of me questioning, and he looked and I said, "Why did you let the Americans do this?" And he said, "We had no choice." Okay, so, and that's it. He had no choice because the US said, "We want to divide Yugoslavia. We don't want an independent, non-aligned Yugoslav country within Europe." At that time, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, the Czech Republic, they're all going into the European Union. First to NATO, then into the European Union. Yugoslavia has to abide. And so Europe didn't do anything against war. And if we took a look at what's going on in Ukraine, it's the same thing. We saw Ukraine, what's going on in Ukraine around the screens here. We know this since 2004. We know what the end game is. We've seen the colored orange revolution organized by the US. We've seen the color revolution, which started off in 2013, and then the 2014 and the bloodbath of the civil war in the Donbass. We all know because we've read Brzezinski and we know American policy. We know what the Americans were doing in Ukraine, and this would end badly. And what did Europe do? What did Brussels do? So we have this big construction, supranational construction, which is supposed to preserve peace and bring peace to our continent. And when there's war, we don't do anything. Worse, we spill oil on the fire. So this is quite crazy when you think about it. At no moment if you look at the war in Yugoslavia and the war in Ukraine, is Brussels saying that we've got to stop the war, that we are against war, that we have to find peace, and that as European peoples who know each other for centuries, we'll be able to find a solution. No. And why don't we do that? Because we are following the policy coming out of Washington. and Washington needs us as a protectorate. So we are the foreign legion, and the U.S. says we'll go to Iraq. We go to Iraq. We'll go to Iran. Maybe we'll go to Iran or to the Middle East. We'll see. And if we have to go to Ukraine and fight Russia, we do that. And there's one just last element that I'd like to add in this is that in the help that the U.S. brought to Europe, there's one very particular element which explains a lot as well. Is that the U.S. at one moment said, "Oh, the French, you've got a lot of debt, but you need our money. So we'll do one thing: is that we'll erase part of that debt, but you'll have to do one thing. And you know what that one thing is? You have to play American movies in your movie theater." So we in the Blooms-Burns agreement, part of our debt with the U.S. was erased, and the U.S. so they shut their eyes on the money that we were supposed to give them back, and they made us play American movies. So then we had under a certain quota, a certain number of weeks where we were. So this means that a sovereign state, to pay off its debt, had to pay the movies. And of course, this is part of all the soft power coming out of the U.S., where they colonized the elites, they colonized the countries without even have to shoot a bullet, because we have become Americanized. And Charles de Gaulle in the 60s said that the biggest problem for France, so this is after the Algerian independence in the 60s, said the biggest problem for France is American imperialism. And he would really be very harsh on what he would call the snob French bourgeois. These were the elite classes, which were already thinking that everything coming out of the U.S. was fantastic. The children of the bourgeoisie had to go to American universities. We had to sport American sweatshirts with names of police departments from New York or from whatever, or films or movies. And progressively, we, as I said earlier, we started changing our economy because we had American consultants telling us how to rebuild our economy. And we started changing our culture because we had access to American movies, American products, American fashion. And this is also one of the ways that the American establishes its empire and makes sure that it keeps the West and other parts of the world under its control.
Would you say the opposition to this level of American control has decreased over time? So, for instance, you gave an example of de Gaulle in the 60s. We can think back to the period right before the Iraq invasion, where Germany and France were very much opposed to that action. Ultimately, they did not succeed. Obviously, the question of Yugoslavia was a little bit earlier, and they seemed to just go along with it. But if you look at European politicians, pundits today, there seems to be very little opposition, even compared to, the early 2000s. Everyone just seems to go along with what's being said. Yes, there are some opposition parties like, AfD in Germany or something like that, where there might be a little bit of a disconnect with the official sort of party line, but it doesn't seem to have as much opposition even as just a few decades ago. Why do you think that might be?
Because I think that the whole political establishment has gone through the processes of being, Americanized. They've all of those is really quite interesting, because if you look at the political spectrum in France is an interesting case, because in France we have strong anti-American sentiment, not against the American people, but against the American establishment, the country, Washington, and all that. I mean, the French are able to distinguish the people and the government, but because in France it's specific because it's coming from the Gaullists. So de Gaulle was a staunch anti-American in this sense that he kicked out American bases. I mean, there's no other European country which has ever done this. He kicked out American bases. So he said, "U.S. go home." He got out of the integrated commandment of NATO. And within the right, you've got the sentiment that France has to be a strong sovereign country and has to be dependent of no other country. And first of all, the U.S. And de Gaulle, he said, U.S., the American empire, is our biggest threat. So we've got this on the right, and of course on the left, the communists and a lot part of the left wing is anti-American because it's anti-imperialist, and so we've got on both sides of the political spectrum I would say people are I would say some anti-Americanism or anti-American empire feeling. However, despite that, once people from these political I'd say sides get to power or get elected, it's like all from one day to the day to the other, they like brush that under the carpet and say, okay, well, we should get out of NATO, maybe not now, but we'll get out of it one day. And a couple of weeks before, they were really staunch anti-NATO. So it's like there's something within this establishment in France where it's still hype, it's still cool, and to be pro-American, and maybe that's not our first concern, and that's an error because it should be our first concern. If you are dependent, if you are perceived by a foreign nation as their protectorate, and you think that you're a free nation, that you've got it all messed up. That means you don't understand what the political paradigm is. So you can't just brush this under the carpet. I think a lot of people are also afraid once they're elected that if they are too much anti-American, then there will be scams against them, that there will be a political agenda in the media or on their own projects saying, oh, what did you do when you were 18 years old? Which political party were you? Or how many girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever did you have, or stuff like that? So we will get into that. And this is not, hysteria. This is the way they work. And this is something that, unfortunately, in France, although we do have in the French Parliament, I would say, whether it's from the Nouveau Front Populaire or from the National Rally, officially they're quite anti-NATO. So I mean, if you ask, and this is I would say this is the majority of our parliament today, but there is no official program on either side or no official project to get us out of NATO. We don't even have demonstrations today in the streets against war, which is something we would have seen in the 60s, and even we did see in France in the 90s against the war in Yugoslavia and the war in Iraq. So we don't have this. I think there's a problem. We spoke about it last time about the fact that people are less politicized than they were before. And this fact about the US is, okay, well, maybe that's too far away. That's not our main concern. And it's true that a lot of the people, they just want to have food in their plates. We've got more than 10 million poor people in France. They see inflation rising. They're afraid for what the crime rates rising and tremendous rates and businesses closing. So they haven't related all of this to the fact that we are a protectorate of a foreign nation. And we'll talk about this, I think, a bit later in the show about how this relationship to the US is actually the cause of our loss of empowerment and the cause of the poverty we're going to, the direction we're going to, which is poverty, and it's a financial subject, but it's a fundamental subject, but it's the elephant in the room, so we don't talk about it. I've seen, just to close on this note, I mean, I have been invited to mainstream media shows, and I know that on some subjects they won't invite me because of the US. So I can talk about Ukraine, I can talk about Kosovo, and then that's okay. But if I start talking about the US and saying things like this, it's like, oh, no, stop, let's, next subject, please. So this is really a hot topic, and the French elite know this, and they really don't want this topic to rise. And so, yeah, it's a pity, but we still believe we could change
all of a sudden there's like static on TV. Sorry guys, technical issues.
There you go.
I know, can't talk about this topic, but do you think it's the reason some of these politicians, once they're elected, they change, at least publicly change their views from being more aggressively, let's say, anti-NATO to being a little bit more wishy-washy? It's because they're basically being integrated into the system, and the system kind of keeps replicating itself regardless of each, whatever individual people may or may not say. So if it's integrated within the very fabric of the European Union, you need to basically get rid of the European Union. I don't know if it's possible to reform the European Union in some other way, because that system will just continue replicating itself, whether or not it almost like it's this big Borg, right? To use a Star Trek quote, that absorbs these people, and it doesn't matter what their original views were. It spits them out in a much more unified way where they're sort of repeating the same storyline regardless of what their personal opinions are. And then of course at that stage it's basically their status, their reputation, the money that comes with that reputation as they're being as their public servants or in some other visible politically important position. And then they wouldn't even or they're afraid because someone filmed them somewhere or dug something up from when they were 14 years old. There's some kind of blackmail, which is a very standard way to control politicians, as we all know, because as soon as someone sort of crosses the line, there is a sex scandal immediately in the media, and you never know whether it's even real or not. I mean, in some cases you
Correct.
do, of course, but yeah. So it seems like, do you think it's more of a systemic issue where something much more drastic needs to change to be able to gain, I guess, more sovereignty and independence?
Yeah, it definitely is systemic. Sorry, Marcelo.
I'll just go a bit far and ask if together with all that, of course, and if it's a kind of a chicken and egg situation, because once these people get elected, then they got used, or perhaps they don't even have the choice. They are exposed with the reality that you don't have the choice. But if you read, for example, SS tactics for choosing leaderships, and we see that a lot in the United States. They usually go for someone that has something, some secret, as Nina mentioned, sex scandals and all that, Epstein lists, all those things, some perhaps conjugal weirdness, I would say. I don't know, things like that. I'm not nothing based on reality, okay?
Of course, Marcelo, we don't have devious ideas like that, so we can't.
Exactly. But just to add to the question, could it be also the chicken and egg situation?
It is quite curious, at least in France, that we do have a political elite, class, which is, so bad. If you would compare French politicians today to politicians from, I would say, maybe one or even two generations ago, they've got nothing in common. We've got low-class politicians, really. And I think that tells a lot about the French society, but they don't know their history. They make a lot of French errors. It's easy to make fun of them. And if you would compare, again, people, whether they're from the left or the right, they knew their history. They knew that they had policies. They knew where they were going. They had ideologies. Whether you were for or against, they would defend politics. And then they were, they were really real politicians. We've got today, they've got, the politicians we've got today are really another class, a much lower class, as I've said, and they don't know the history. They don't speak correctly. They say left on Monday. They say right on Wednesday. They go in one direction and the other. And it's highly plausible that a lot of these just arrive there because they are corruptible, because they have maybe some of these. How do these people get there? Or so maybe just the people. There's another idea, but maybe that just the real smart people who are politicians, they don't get there because they're not corruptible enough, or they said, I don't want to even go in there because they will corrupt me, and I prefer living my own life. But to some extent, to see that from the left to the right, we've got so many people, not all, but so many people which just don't know what they're talking about, don't know what to do for France, that you are entitled to say maybe some of these people are in there and will be promoted because we know that they will be bad. They will do whatever we tell them to do because all they want is a position, the job, and the glory that goes with it. And maybe some of these really do have some bad stories that they definitely don't want to see. And we can control them. Again, these are some of the oldest tricks of the trade. So this is what surprised me. So the French political system and elite today is globally of a very, very bad, I would say, extraction. That's something which is definite. And let us not forget the role of the American NGOs, an embassy, and all the. We've got the American embassy a couple of years ago. I remember they had a project for the French suburbs. So this is an idea. They had projects. So they would go to the French suburbs, and with American taxpayers' money, they would tell the people in the suburbs, this is what you've got to ask for in France. This is how you're going to get integrated in French society. So this is crazy. This is really crazy. So this is not even the French government to go see, which is going to see. Imagine, I don't know, I'm going to take something maybe not so provocative. The Swiss or the Argentinians, they would go to France and do the same thing. And okay, rather imagine if the Russians did this, or the North Koreans, they would have a project for the French suburbs. How crazy we would all be. But we don't say anything when it's the US. And they've got these NGOs not only in France, they've got them all over the world. I always remind this quote of Alan Weinstein, who was the founder of the it's USA, no, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. And he would say, we do openly today what the CIA used to do covertly. This is exactly what they do. They change, they're into social re-engineering. They want to review the society. They want to tell, and they want to divide. Again, the whole thing is about divide and conquer. That's what we said at the beginning. And this goes into every nation. So we've got a bad class political elite, and we've got foreign interference, and we're watching Netflix and using, I would say, the U.S. internet on a daily basis. So we, at the end, there's a Stockholm syndrome here. and we don't know how to get out of it. I would say, however, that on the social networks, so we'll see how long they let us on this. I mean, more and more people are starting to understand, because they could hide this before. You could hide what was going on with Mossadegh in Iran in 53. You could hide what was going on in Guatemala with the Arbenz around that same period of time, because people didn't have access to information. Now, those who are looking for information, they could find. They can find. You can find out what's going on in Moldavia. You can find out what's really going on in Ukraine and Georgia. Not everybody's going there, but we are. You know, there are more and more holes in that wall that they've built around their protectorate, and I think this is actually something quite positive. And even a lot of the people, even in the U.S., they don't want this empire anymore. So this, we have to see this as something positive, but it's a pain. It's a pain on a daily basis, because I think European countries deserve better than that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point about social media, which, we bring up all the time, but very anecdotally for me, seeing the types of responses I get about the current situation in Georgia with the anti-government protests, a lot of people understand the dynamics as opposed to 10 years ago in Ukraine. That's not the only color revolution attempt, of course, but again, this is for me very anecdotal, but when you have hundreds and hundreds of comments and the people seem to understand what they're talking about, not everyone, but a lot of them more so than 10 years ago. And again, yes, some of them might be bots, some of them might have been, agents sitting behind their keyboards. But even all of that, put aside, it seems like there's just more awareness about the dynamics of these protests and whom they benefit and whom they do not benefit. So I find that really interesting, the chasm between the official media and the social media and what's being pushed to us. And we also talk about what we call the middle managers here, right? These great politicians that are completely interchangeable. It's more about the chair in which they sit as opposed to the particular person, right? It's the Kaya Kallases of the world, of who's recently been promoted. Would you say that for all her faults, Angela Merkel was the last sort of serious European politician, the adult in the room? Again, for all her faults, I'm not a fan, but it seems like compared to what we have to deal with today, it's just night and day. It's just kind of remarkable. As soon as she left, we've got Scholz, and it's like, that's it.
And can you believe we're regretting Angela Merkel? I mean, this is something I never thought I would say. And again, because this is, again, a class of politicians which had education, which knew the political system, which knew their history, which knew their language, which knew how to speak to it. And Angela Merkel would not have let the situation, I think, honestly, even though she has done a lot of bad things, I mean, there's no doubt about that, she would not have let the situation get out of hand as it is today, because it was probably not easy for her either, as well, with 100,000 U.S. servicemen on her territory, and the U.S. more or less telling her what to do to try to be independent was not easy. But the fact is that she was of course a better politician than Scholz, which is, I don't know, he definitely messed out his career or whatever he wanted to do. He should have chosen something else, because it's a catastrophe for Germany now.
So I think this would be a good transition to talk about in a little bit more detail what's happened to European economy since the escalation in Ukraine in 2022, where Europe was buying cheap Russian energy. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. This energy was fueling successful European manufacturing, especially in Germany, but not just in Germany. Germany obviously made an ideological decision to give up nuclear power, which, I mean, it kind of is beyond me, and made this ideological decision in favor of, transitioning to all green up until a certain point, which, there's nothing wrong with green energy when it makes sense, but you can't just make a decision that would harm you as it did in the end. And all of a sudden, there is this escalation and there are sanctions, and Europe is no longer able to, in many ways, buy Russian energy. Obviously, it's in some cases, it's been getting it via India with a markup. And India, of course, is very happy with the situation because it's making the money that wasn't there before. But can you talk a little bit about what's happened in the last 2 years and why the U.S. became, I would say by design, the leading trade partner for the EU, and also how China plays into this, because obviously China is a huge economic power. So, and we've seen all these visits, right? Annalena just had an embarrassing visit to Beijing, where, as per usual, instead of arriving in some kind of a mutually beneficial situation, she criticized all the standard key points that European politicians go there to criticize, which is very different from diplomacy. I mean, this is not what you do, but it's kind of expected, I think, in today's day and age. So that relationship between China and the EU obviously would be mutually beneficial, but the fact that now it's declined a little bit, if you can talk about that in relation to what we've been discussing, that would be super helpful.
I mean, if we needed proof that European elite were, subservient to American interests, or that we were a protectorate and that we were not independent and there was no such thing as a sovereign European Union and the defense of European interests, it's what is going on right now. Can you imagine that Russia is just the biggest European country that exists in population and land size? It's 17 million square kilometers. It's just huge. And it's one of the richest nations on earth in terms of natural resources. So any country on the world which would be a neighbor of Russia would try to get along with such a powerful country. It just makes sense. And if that country were Germany, or if that country were anybody else, you would like to have good relations with such a powerful country, especially if that country hasn't done anything bad to you. If he invades you, okay, that's another problem. But in the case of France or Germany, there's no invasion whatsoever. So we had a relationship. And there was a strong relationship. Germany had a prosperous economy thanks to cheap and good quality Russian gas. France was, many people don't know this, France was the first foreign employer in Russia. A lot of big French companies settled in Russia and opened Leroy Merlin, Auchan, different companies, and even gas, Total Energy, they were the President Gas. By the way, they're still there today, but that's another subject. So we had good relationships, and we had everything to develop because we needed the natural resources and they needed some of the products that we had. And together we had, Russia is something that they've got a bigger percentage of engineers than we have. So together, again, if we get to this idea that we can get along in this multipolar world, the smartest idea the European politicians could have had is, how do we get along with the biggest European country who's not in the European Union? So do we break up the European Union? Do we do something else? But in any case, we get along with that country. And we're doing all the contrary. At the same time, just to get to your point on Russia, we've got China. China is building these new Silk Roads, which wants to develop, peace and prosperity through economic initiatives. And even J.D. Vance, the future vice president of Trump, said, well, listen, we're trying to control the war with wars, and Chinese is helping the poor and building roads. We've got it wrong. Okay, so this is just common sense. They want to work together. We can work together. This doesn't mean that the European countries are going to be slaves or protectorates. Never has in the Russia, or neither have the Russians or the Chinese have some sort of doctrine where they want to control us. They just want to make sure that they can do business with us if we're interested. And we decided not to do that. And we decided not only not to do that, but to go to war with them. We started off with started color revolutions. The European Union participated in the Maidan. And don't forget, our world-renowned famous philosopher who was a Nobel Peace Prize of Death, Bernard-Henri Lévy, was in Maidan. He's telling us to go to Georgia. He told us to go to Iraq.
He was everywhere. It's like he's the vulture. Everywhere he shows up, something is about to happen.
Exactly. So he was there, and our foreign policy was all about toppling a democratically elected president in Ukraine, and we're doing the same thing in Georgia. This is totally counterproductive. We have no interest besides serving the U.S. So people say, "Oh, you're just saying that. How can you prove it?" Well, the Bible says you judge a tree by its fruit. What have we gained out of these interventions? Nothing. Has France gained anything with bombing Serbia? Nothing. In bombing Libya? Nothing. In bombing Afghanistan? Nothing. Germany? Maybe a bit more. The U.S. gains out of all these foreign wars. And in Europe today, so France has got kicked out of Russia. And also with all these sanctions, 17,000 sanctions against Russia, Russians are no longer buying agricultural products or technical products that they used to buy from France, from Spain, from Italy, from Germany. So they said, okay, you guys don't want to sell? The Russians had the good idea saying, we'll try to build them ourselves. And if we can't, we'll find other suppliers. And guess what? They found a lot of suppliers and started doing things themselves. Not only have they started building themselves, but they export what they build themselves. And now their exports are competing, they're competing with our products. So we really shot, I mean, Viktor Orban from the Prime Minister of Hungary said that we shot ourselves in the lungs by doing this. So not only have we cut off the links with, even the IMF says that Russia is the biggest European country in terms of GDP in PPI or PPP, one of the, they're the first. So we've cut the links off of this. They're continuing. I mean, Russia has very small unemployment. They've got something like 17% indebtedness. And what do we have? So Germany has trade deficits for practically the first time in 30 years. That means that they're importing more than they're exporting. And they're supposed to be the lung of the European Union. We're all behind Germany in helping them to export, because some way that's going to help us. So they've got a trade deficit. France has a trade deficit. We've both got, these are two of the biggest countries of the European Union. We've got huge debts, which are over 100% of GDP. And so we don't have the means of waging wars where our countries are really crumbling. There's a French political analyst called Jérôme Fourquet, who made an analysis of how the metaphors of France, which is totally changing. So the effects of the soft power and the views that we have on the family, on religion, on society, and all that are crumbling. And at the same time, we're extremely poor. And we've got many companies, whether it's in France, Germany, Italy, they're going out of business. And as we spoke about before, you've got businesses from Germany, which are actually moving out to the US. So cui bono? So European nations are all poor because of this. And plus the war in Ukraine, just to speak about Ukraine, is costing us something like 200 billion euros. So we don't have money for our hospitals, for our school systems, for the judicial system, for the police. We don't have money for that, but we have money for this war, which is not bringing us anything, and it's cut us off from one of the potentially biggest partners we could have had within the European Union. Who's taking advantage of this? Who's selling us the gas and the petrol that Russia is not selling us anymore? The United States. Who is taking in some of the high-tech companies from Europe, which are not investing in Europe, but because of the taxes, because there's the taxes and because the energy is so high? The United States. They're the only ones which are getting benefit and profit out of this situation. So it's not easy to understand that from the beginning, all of this story about Ukraine and all was in the interest of the US. And Brzezinski said it again. It is extremely important to tell all our viewers that all of this is coming out from the mouth of prominent American neoconservatives, historians, politicians who don't even hide this. Brzezinski said that Western Europe was a protectorate, and he also said that to cut Russia off of Eurasia so that it would no longer be an empire, we had to cut off Ukraine. So this is again, and other Americans which disagree with Brzezinski's positions, but who agree on this on this fact, like Mersheimer, like Hudson, like Jeffrey Sachs, who's one of the only persons who knows correctly the Kremlin and the White House, and he's the first to say we should never have done this. We went to war to cut Ukraine, to cut Russia off of Europe, so that we could make sure that Western Europe would always remain a protectorate, and they would. So this means that as a Western protectorate and a poor Western protectorate, we will depend even more on the United States, because when we were manufacturing planes, automobiles, we still do a little bit of that, but if we can't produce them anymore, what are we going to buy? Definitely not Chinese automobiles, not Russian automobiles. There are no automobile manufacturers on the other continents, so we're going to be buying American, maybe probably. And again, you do see like countries like Poland. This is extremely important. In the European Union, each country pays some sort of tax to the European Union so that it can run. And you've got countries which pay more than they receive. France and Germany pay more than they receive from the European Union. And the European Union, for example, gives more to Poland. But who does Poland buy its weaponry from? Who does Poland buy its nuclear power plants from? Who does it buy its helicopters from? From another European Union country? which manufactures them. We manufacture a lot of those in France. No, they buy everything from the United States. So we are giving out help to American companies so that they can take businesses which should have been kept for European countries. I mean, we've got so many examples of this to show that this whole European thing is just serving the interests of the United States. And we are in some sort of Kafka, Orwellian situation, which we've got these technocrats totally disconnected with what's going on the ground, and who think that this is a great idea, that waging wars, getting people killed, serving the US, and being able to go do maybe a conference in a lifetime at Yale or Stanford is something fantastic. And this is the best way to be serving the master, is to be helping him achieve his plans for our continent. So we've got, voluntary servitude. This is what Etienne de la Boétie called, speaking about people compared to their nations. But we've got this at a nation state level where we've got nations which are serving the interests of a foreign nation. And of course, all this is what empires do. So, and the situation for Europe today is dire. As I said, the social situation is extremely bad. As Fortier said, and I spoke about a couple of minutes ago, and the economic situation is bad as well because of you cannot be competitive if your energy is so expensive and you don't have natural resources. So we don't have natural resources and we've got expensive energy. We're going to be maybe some touristic spot, or I don't know, something like that. Maybe at the end we will be making sweatshirts for the Americans or something like that.
For the Chinese.
For the Chinese?
For the Chinese, yeah, but they don't want the Chinese in. So we'll see if we'll see what goes on with China, but maybe for the Chinese.
Is there a way to untangle this mess? I mean, in my opinion, China is such a big economy that naturally, eventually, things will turn towards Eurasia if they haven't already. Even if there are all these delayed indicators of, the US trying to apparently bring Europe down so that it could bring itself back up, or at least certain members of a society, maybe from the oligarch class. But do you see a way out of this? Do you see a way to untangle this mess in a way that would be the least painful for the European continent?
Yeah, definitely. I think, Aristotle said that the path to liberty is courage. So we need courage. And I think as the situation is going to be more and more complicated, we will have people which will come out of the European political scene and who will not take it any longer, because it's going to be complicated. We saw it during the coronavirus syndrome, people dying. We had very bad healthcare, and not only because of the virus, by the way, but that's another subject. But the situations are getting so bad that people are really getting extremely angry about the situation. It's so easy to keep the people sleeping when you can have all you want, when you can go on vacation, when you can you've got your supermarkets which you can buy whatever you want. You can buy a huge flat screens or 2 cars or 3 televisions or whatever. It's easy with the consumer society to do that. But once that consumer society dies out and people start getting poor, people start eating. In France, we've got people who eat, millions of people who have got difficulties feeding themselves, and who eat every other day, or who don't eat a supper every day. So these people are going to get really mad, and people are seeing this happen. So you can't hide. This is something you cannot hide. And I would wish this didn't happen, but this is the only, I would say, positive aspect, is that this is going to wake up more people. And I think that they're going to find out what is going on. And we do have some courageous politicians in Europe. Again, there's the example of Hungary. And Hungary is a small nation. It doesn't have the second biggest ocean front like France does. It doesn't have this big history of colonies and the whole. It's a small country in Europe. But Orban is courageous, and he says, I won't say it here, but he's telling the European Union that he's going to do what he wants, and he's going to negotiate with Russia. He took the initiative to discuss with Ukraine, with Russia, with China, with the US to try to find a peace solution in Ukraine. He said to the European Union that he didn't want their laws on same-sex marriage or on pornography. He said that he didn't want the immigrants, and it's a small country. So if Orban could do that, why can't we do that in Italy? Why can't we do that in Spain, in France, in other countries? So I think this is positive. We have other politicians like Fico in Slovakia, which is also quite courageous. to some extent, Vucic, which is not in the European Union in Serbia, is also trying to stay independent, and he's surrounded by NATO countries who've got one dream is eating Serbia up. So we do have, and I do see in the alternative political parties, more and more people saying that the European Union has, I don't think we can build it differently. I think there's a different way of working between European countries, but I think that the basis of the European Union are flawed, and you can't work together if from the beginning you're going to be supernatural. I mean, that's above the national entities of the different countries and supranational. I meant to say, this is something that just doesn't work. We've got unelected people giving us orders, telling us, making us wage wars, making us enemies of countries we don't even hate. I mean, we're in the crosshairs of Russia now because we're participating in a war killing Russian soldiers, and we don't hate Russians at all. So I mean, we just want to discuss and find a solution. They're putting us in such a situation where we're living targets now. So this is something which is extremely crazy, and we don't even have the means to defend ourselves. So this is even crazier. I mean, if the French army would go to war, I think it would last 2 months, and then I mean, these are the French military saying this. So I mean, so this is the truth of the situation. So I think this is something which is extremely bad globally, but in these bad situations, we will see the men and women who will be like during the resistance in France, will have the courage, and we need those people. We need those people to say, okay, I'm going to stand out. I don't care about the flat screens. I don't care about the number of cars. I don't care about that. I'm going to fight because I believe in liberty. I believe in free speech. I don't want these oligarchs sending my children or myself to war. And we do see more and more of these people, I think, around Europe. And I don't see how they can get out. I think, again, what I do see is that they're tired. They've got all they wanted, these elites and oligarchs. They changed the society. They got rid of Christianity. They've got the social, I mean, the consumer society in there. They're telling us what they want. They control the schools. They control the businesses. They've got all that. And when you control everything, at one moment, you're not fighting for anything anymore. And so you tend to, to drop your guard a bit. And that's where those who've got everything to fight for, especially the poor people in the society, those who are in a distressed situation, they've got a lot of reasons to fight because they've been kicked out of the system. And I think that this is going to be positive for us because more and more people say we can't continue like this because we don't want the war and we just want to live normal lives, a bit of culture, some food, some wine, and enjoy ourselves as we know that we can do that. So this is something which is, I think, we are going through difficult times, but I remain optimistic because I see more and more people who are waking up. They've out of that grotto or that cavern of Plato. They see the real world, and now they're waking their brothers and sisters, saying, "Listen, we got to get out of this conundrum and out of this nightmare."
Perhaps Orban is so brave because he's a good Catholic man, so there are no videos about him floating around. So he is not corruptible. Therefore, he can do what he wants. And on the topic of.
It was George Galloway who said this week or last week with an interview with Larry Johnson, the difference between embarrassment and shame. If you caught me on bed with my wife, I'll be embarrassed. If you caught me on bed with your wife, that's shame.
You got it.
And Italy. Just to mention Italy, it seems one of the countries that. It's hard to say because Italy's been playing the game of Brussels, but at the same time it's not. It seems like because there's big difference when I see, for example, Macron talking smack or Olaf Scholz and Elena 360, saying all those things. They are belligerents. They are really belligerent. While you see Meloni, she's it really seems like she's hijacked there.
I never thought I would say this, but we're missing Berlusconi, right? As another politician
let's bring him on
from the old guard, doing his little parties in Russia with.
He was, a lot of people here miss him.
He had more status as a politician and more seriousness despite all the right, exactly.
And I've been hearing that situation in France so bad that people there are eating snails.
Well, we always eat snails. I mean, this is something that we've been doing for centuries. So that's
So
That's a bad joke.
it's a bad joke. So
it's not even a joke. We enjoy that. But it is true. And I haven't even spoken about the UK, by the way, which is no longer in the European Union, but was going through a terrible economic situation as well. And it's quite crazy to see that that they're saying that they have to pursue the war in Ukraine. And Bernabuk as well, from Germany, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said that whatever the German people say, her priority is Ukraine. How crazy can you get? I mean, they can think it. They used to think stuff like that, but now they're saying it out loud. When you're elected, you're supposed to be representing the interests of your own country, of your own people. And if you can't feed your people, if you can't find them jobs, if your companies are leaving the country, and I mean, again, we're talking about over 100% indebtedness. We're talking about trade deficits. So this is not just a delicate situation. This is a very bad situation for the West. And they're saying our priority is the war in Ukraine. So this is mad. And again, I was speaking about Kafka because you're pinching yourself, saying I'm in a nightmare. They can't really be saying this. I mean, how will the generations after us, if there are any, judge our politicians? We are definitely the stupidest era of Europe and since the caveman. I mean, this is really something which is quite crazy, and we're going through this, and you could pitch yourself as hard as you want. This is the true situation. We've got politicians which are so convinced that the world will be better if the U.S. manages everything, that we're committing suicide, and we're closing our eyes on the killing of other Europeans between each other, and we're sacrificing our economies and our sovereignty. Because once you've got no more sovereignty, you're no longer a people. You just cease to exist. You're in the protectorate. You obey.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it doesn't come to what you're describing, where there's a tipping point and it's an economic tipping point, because I keep thinking back to the post-World War I situation, or around World War I, where the Russian economic situation and social situation was so bad that there was a successful revolution. But Germany, that did have revolutionary sentiments, did not have a revolution that, even despite the devastation of World War I, its economic situation was better and the recovery was quicker. So I'm thinking about, that contrast between the two. So ultimately, if, like you're saying, it's not about flat screen TVs and multiple cars, if there's nothing to eat, things might get much, much more serious. And I really hope it doesn't get to that point, because it's a mess that will be much, much harder to get out of. So I'm hoping, like you're saying, that there might be more of these courageous politicians, like you're saying, coming out, and just the general public awareness, as we've seen on social media. Again, it's pretty anecdotal, but I would say the statistics for media trust, mainstream media trust, being dismally low is also very much, indicative of that. And it's a little bit more scientific, for the lack of a better word. But what do you think might happen with, the change of administration in the U.S.? I don't think that, the Russian side kind of expects American foreign policy to stay its course, because that's how it's always been, at least for, the past few decades. However, do you think there might be sort of a more positive surprise coming with the new Trump administration coming in, with the situation in Ukraine being as bad as it is? I know right now the outgoing administration is pumping as much effort into escalating the war, it seems, in the last literal, month and a half of being in power. But where do you see that particular component of the dynamic here?
Well, definitely Trump will not put an end to the American empire. That's for sure. He doesn't have the time, he doesn't have the means, but I do think that he understands that the U.S. can no longer be the hegemon it used to be. I think that this is something it can. I mean, the U.S. lost in Syria. We'll see what goes on now, but they lost in Syria. They lost in Afghanistan. 20 years in Afghanistan, they were supposed to take the power from the Taliban, and they gave it back to the Taliban, and they're losing in Ukraine. So I mean, this says a lot about the U.S. re-engineering around the world and their color revolutions, or even their military might. This is much, I would say, overstated. That I mean, it's not as powerful as many people think that it has been. And the Russian army is not the Taliban. So I think that Trump knows this. I think also I think maybe I'm naive, but something inside of him says that okay, he's getting older. He's probably acting more like a grandfather than he used to be, like a young warrior or young, I don't know, adventurer when he was a mogul in U.S. Business affairs and stuff like that. So I do think that there is some sort of sincerity when he speaks about peace. I don't forget that McKinley spoke about peace and then went to war for Guam and the Philippines, that Wilson spoke about peace and then went into World War I, Truman World War II, and Johnson said that he didn't understand why American boys would go 10,000 miles to fight in Vietnam where young Asians could do that, and we know how that ended. So I'm not naive on that, but I do think that maybe he is a bit more credible than maybe McKinley or Wilson. We'll see that. Something which is interesting coming. So he will not put an end to the empire, but he will choose, I think, the zones of interest which he wants. And so he'll barter them. He's a salesman, and I think this is the way he sees it. The only element which is how far will the deep state go to stop him from doing that? Because he does have neoconservatives around around Washington, within the Pentagon, who don't want to admit that they've lost the Cold War, that they don't want to admit that they're losing the hot war today, and who do think that the only way for going around the world politics is using the hammer. You know, this is the same American saying: when your only tool is a hammer, you tend on seeing your problems all as nails. So this is the way a lot of people think in Washington today. So can he get rid of that swamp? He didn't do this the first time around. So this is something we saw. I mean, you can't get rid of the swamp if you work with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo in your team. What's interesting is he has placed a lot of some neoconservatives, and then so we have. I think we'll see Rubio in foreign affairs and stuff like that as Secretary of State. I'm not so sure that was the wisest decision. It's quite bizarre decision, by the way, because him and Rubio are supposed to be arch enemies. They don't like each other. Rubio said Trump was a crook. I don't remember what Trump said about Rubio, but anyways, this is politics. But we'll see that. However, he has put some interesting people within his government. We'll see if they get nominated. But I think somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's going to be the head of intelligence in the U.S., is something which is quite daring. And I didn't think he would go to that extent. And if she really can remain independent and she can really have access to the information, and if I were Trump, I would definitely say, listen, I've been castigized. You've slandered me. You've called me names. You've accused me of so many things. But I'm going to show you information about those people who said those things about me. I'm going to show you the real facts about the wars we waged and why this has nothing to do with the interest of the Yugoslavs, the Iraqis, or people in South America or in Africa. If I were him, I would do this as soon as possible to calm down. I mean, first of all, to show the newcomers that he's got collateral against him. He'll probably use some of the information he won't disclose and say, listen, I can use this against you. If he does that and he does show some of that information, that's positive, because I think he's got to put an end to this American empire. The fact that Robert Kennedy is going to be working on health, the fact that they want to look into the fact, whatever we think about Elon Musk, but the fact that he wants to look into the American administrations and see, I think this is interesting, and this is radically different, much different than what he did in the first term. He's got 2 years to convince the Americans, because after that, he's got the midterms. And if he wants to go quickly, I think he's got to go into blitzkrieg mode. He's got to attack right away to show that he's not going to be persuaded or convinced, or I would say he has to show that he's not afraid of the American deep state. And I think he's got to attack and show this information and go directly to the table, the negotiation table with Russia, with China, and find something. That's a lot of work to do in 100 days. So he probably can't do everything, but I will give him a bit more. I would say, I would think it's more possible this time than last time. If after a month or two, we don't see anything really radical in the nature of the discussions or the types of information that he's going to disclose or that he's going to take, it's going to be the same thing as it was before. And it will be the same old thing. And definitely, as Hugo Chavez said at the European nations, I mean, he said the only people who could defend us from the United States are the Americans themselves. But I think at that stage, the Americans will really have to do something, because that would show that their whole political system is totally corrupt. You can't have somebody coming out and saying, I'm going to clean the swamp, I'm going to stop wars, and still have that swamp and still have the wars. After one moment, the U.S., which is responsible for so much of these wars and wrongdoing on this earth today, they have to really take their own power back, because the political system is not enabling them to do that.
Yeah, in my opinion, at best, there will be more of a turn about containing China and maybe trying to de-escalate with Russia. I think in the best case scenario, that would be the focal point. But who knows? It might be nothing. I mean, it might be a nothing burger. Just fight some of these brave decisions with Tulsi and so on and so forth. Marcelo, we have any interesting questions, or have they been addressed as we've been talking?
Well, not too many questions today, but there is one from Who Cares, and I think it's kind of interesting just to mention, as we already talked about this before, about the whole situation in Europe. He asks if this has something to do with the extremely high number of migrants and refugees. Well, I would like to add before going that just recently, Keir Starmer kind of let it out that all these open borders have been a plan. And I mean, we talk about this for in my channel for a year, because the channel has a year, but other people talk about that kind of openly. Yeah, this has all been designed. And yeah, what do you think about that? I think it collaborates a bit. It's not the only, of course, reason, but what do you think about that, Nikola?
Listen, I think that was crazy that Starmer said that this was by design. And I think it's not a surprise. Again, this is one of those topics that people used to say that conspirationist people would say this and this was not true. And then all of a sudden you've got the Prime Minister of the UK saying, well, actually, it's not a conspiracy. This is true. So again, I mean, there's so many of these. Again, who is taking benefit of this? We've arrived in a situation today where I think there's been immigration in France and many European countries, and that's not an issue. But it has not been controlled. And we've been opening massively the borders, and many immigrants came in thinking that this would be the El Dorado, that they would have the flat screens, the 2 or 3 cars, the big house, the nice wives, and everything like that they've seen on TV. And when they arrive, it's not the case. A lot of them don't have jobs. Those who do get jobs are badly paid jobs, and they live in subnormal, maybe not subnormal, but at least not so decent conditions. And so they're not taking advantage of this. And the French are not taking advantage of this because the immigrants coming in are working for lower wages. And so that's lowering the wages of the French working. And it's there is no integration of these immigrants. So the way that they have conducted these immigration policies, that they took populations from other countries and they put them all in the same place, where they created their own ghettos. And there is no mixture between the French and these people. And you can't integrate foreigners if you don't have a policy whereby you explain that you're being greeted in a new country, that you're welcoming them, that they have to do some efforts on the language, on the history and all that, but that you're going to help them and that you're going to help them integrate. There's been no policy. They just said, okay, you go in that part of town. And then, and what did these people do? They didn't integrate. There was no path for them to integrate. So they got together and they recreated the societies they left. And of course, they're quite fed up and quite mad because they find out that there is no such thing as this European dream, that they left their countries and that they're cleaning houses here, where some of these people had better educated or better jobs in their own countries, and they're in the taxis here. And being a taxi is a fantastic job, but if you think you're going to be a very rich man and own a castle and have everything which goes around, you're not going to do that being a taxier. So, and probably most jobs. So there's a lot of frustration, and we have arrived at a level of numbers which is getting dangerous, because there are some parts of France or Europe which don't resemble Europe. And again, I do think that what the UK Prime Minister said is true. This is part of a program to destruct the European nations. This definitely, at one moment I thought that, okay, these people are just plain stupid and they're just ideologues and they just think it's going to be working well. But the more I study this, the more I'm convinced that there are people who really do want to destroy European nations. They want to destroy Christianity. They want to destroy our traditions. They want this whole new world, with the new world order, with just the individuals, with no unions, no churches, no associations, just that individual with the state and multinational companies. So easier to control an individual rather than controlling nations and populations and churches and religions and what you want. So I really do think that there are people who want to break down, I would say, that what our societies were built on. And this was by design, and it's not working. It's not working at all. There's a lot of crime in France. There's a lot of frustration. There's hatred which is growing between the communities, and this is all saddening because we shouldn't be going through this. And the communities are fighting against each other at the lowest levels, but the puppeteers, who are pulling the strings, they're taking advantage of the system. They're taking advantage of the low wages. They're taking advantage of having no more unions or no more churches defending the people. So I think, again, this is something which is extremely important. And this is, I would say, the fulcrum that of politics that we have to attack. It's not just should VAT be at 21.2%, or we should attack the people who are responsible of this situation, who have opened the borders, who have let the economies crumble, who have decided to outsource our companies to China instead of keeping the jobs here in France. These are the people who are responsible for this situation. It's not the immigrants; it's the people who are responsible for the situation. And these people, the only thing that they're doing is saying, "Listen, don't speak about us, don't talk about us, don't think about us. Your problem is the immigrant, or your problem is this is something we have to be careful of." But it is true that if the immigration continues as it is in some parts of Western Europe, will no longer be Western Europe, and that is a major problem.
Well, these are the people who also support war, right? The concept of the welfare warfare state. I don't endorse every single feature of the concept, but if you think about the recent waves with, starting with, the destruction of Libya that opened up this huge flood of refugees coming into Europe, and of course more recently with Ukraine, and the women being in the sex trade, all the conspiracy theories about children being sold into God knows what. It's all connected. So there is a support for war coming from people who are also supporting some of these other policies that you're discussing. So it's a big puzzle that we tried to untangle today to the best of our ability with the time constraints. Well, I think this is a good time to wrap up our conversation. To wrap this up, do you have any recent projects that you've been working on since we saw you last on our channel?
Well, listen, with my humanitarian association, West East, in these past, the object of this association is to get the European people to get to know each other better.
I saw you were in Poland. Your people were in Poland.
Exactly. So we're trying to get the people from Europe to work together out of the European Union Atlanticist philosophy. I think it's in our interest in the multipolar world, which is coming, whether we would like it or not, to get to know each other better, to get to work better outside of the European Union. So we've got to get rid of those shackles and still keep contacts, because it's quite ridiculous people going to war between European people or either with other continents. But we can already start getting along. We've got Greek and Christian civilization history together, and I think we've got a lot out of that. So we helped some poor kids in Poland. We helped a school and people in Kosovo, the Serbs of Kosovo, who are going through a very difficult, very bad situation now. I mean, we're not speaking a lot about this situation, but the Serbs of Kosovo and Metohija are going through a terrible situation, and the Albanian, I would say, puppet regime in the Banana Republic of Kosovo are really trying to expel and get rid. They're doing ethnic cleansing without killing, but it's still ethnic cleansing of the Serbs. So we're helping the people in Kosovo, and we just bought a car for a humanitarian association we work with in Donbass. And we're preparing the next humanitarian mission there. We've been helping people in Donbass since 2014, and we're not going to stop. So that's what we're doing with the humanitarian association called West East. And I'm working on a new book where I'm trying to give high hopes, try to be optimistic in the situation we're going through. And I'm trying to show how we've been through bad situations before and that we've got out of that. But you need what Aristotle is called courage. There's no liberty without courage.
Thank you for highlighting it. It sounds like your organization has grown because you have multiple projects going. So for all you guys out there listening, go to Nikola's Twitter /X. I'm not sure if you have West East linked.
Not yet.
I know it's not in English, right? The name is actually in French. Maybe I'll throw it into the description box to make sure people can see your humanitarian pursuits. Well, thank you so much for jumping on again. This was really sort of pessimistic with a little bit of optimism. all the Kafkaesque adventures that you've described aside. So thank you for coming back on. We would love to have you back to
Whatever
maybe
you want.
talk. Well, specifically to talk about, like you said, the situation with the Serbs of Kosovo, other than people who are Serb or politicians who are involved in that directly, I don't really see much media coverage at all. I mean, sometimes you have to go to, Google Translate sources coming from either Serbian or I can read directly in Russian, but there's really not much coverage. So I think we might have you back for that because it's such an important topic. And it also plays into what we've been discussing in terms of dividing and conquering. So, Marcelo, any parting words?
Well, yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Nikola, again to coming to the show. This the Winter Latina show is the second time. In the IDM is the fifth time already, right? Yeah, we came twice. No, the fourth time. I exaggerated one. And always a pleasure. It's always an amazing conversation. And thank you very much. And thank you everybody that's been watching us today. Remember that all the links are going to be linked on the description. Nicola's social medias and his projects, as well as Amazon links for his books are also here if you want to buy. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nina. And see you guys next time. Bye-bye, Nicola.
See you soon.
Bye,
Thank
Nina.
you,
Bye,
guys.
Marcelo. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.